The wind howled through the valley like a wounded beast, carrying the scent of damp earth and something older, something forgotten. Lucian Graves stood at the entrance of the ancient silver mine, his broad frame cloaked in the weight of the storm. The letter crumpled in his grip, its words a mere formality. He had inherited this land, this forsaken ruin of a mine, from a bloodline he barely knew. Yet it was not duty that pulled him forward. It was something else, something primal. The villagers had warned him. There is a reason this mine has remained untouched, a reason no man dares to claim it. They spoke of whispers in the dark, of shadows that moved when no light should cast them. But Lucian was not a man easily frightened. He was more than that, stronger, faster, a creature of instinct and hunger. The beast inside him stirred as he stepped forward, boots crunching against loose stone. The deeper he went, the heavier the air became. Cold, damp, thick with the scent of metal, and something richer, something almost sweet. The tunnel stretched into oblivion, but his body knew the way, as if something unseen was guiding him. The pulse in his veins quickened, his breath turned shallow. And then he saw her, chained to the cavern wall, bathed in the pale glow of luminescent crystals, was the most exquisite creature he had ever laid eyes on. She was a vision of impossible beauty. Her dark hair spilled over her shoulders like liquid night, her skin porcelain and flawless, untouched by time. Her gown, though tattered at the edges, clung to her delicate frame in a way that made his throat tighten. And her lips, parted just slightly, held the color of crushed roses, a stark contrast to the silver shackles biting into her wrists. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Crimson, piercing, knowing. She was awake, watching him, and she was waiting. A slow, haunting smile curved her lips. "You came." Her voice was a whisper, yet it echoed through him, unraveling something deep in his core. It wasn't fear that gripped him. It was something far more dangerous. Lucian stepped closer, his every movement measured, controlled, though it took effort. His instincts roared to life, demanding that he take, claim, consume. He clenched his fists. "Who are you?" She tilted her head, chains rattling softly. "I have been here for centuries, forgotten by time, bound by silver, waiting for the one who could set me free." Her gaze traced over him with a slow, deliberate hunger. "Waiting for you." His jaw tightened. "You know me." She let out a breath, soft, longing, as if she had tasted his name on her tongue 1,000 times. Lucian. His body tensed. He had never told her his name. Something about her unsettled him, but not in a way that made him want to run. No, it made him want to get closer. It made his blood burn. The beast inside him, wild, untamed, recognized something in her, something forbidden, something irresistible. Lucian reached out, his fingers hovering over the silver chains that imprisoned her delicate wrists. The metal sizzled against his skin, but he didn't pull away. She inhaled sharply, and for the first time, her confidence wavered. "Careful, wolf," she whispered. "Once you touch me, there is no turning back." His lips curved into a smirk, though his chest was tight. "I don't turn back." The moment his fingers brushed her skin, a jolt of power surged between them, dark, electric, intoxicating. The cavern trembled, the air crackled, and deep within the mine, something ancient began to stir. She gasped, her lashes fluttering, and when her eyes met his again, they were darker, needier. Lucian exhaled, his voice a low growl. "What are you?" Serafina smiled, slow and deadly. "Yours." And then everything changed. Lucian's breath came slow and heavy, the air between them charged with something dark and ancient. His fingers still burned from where they had grazed her skin, but he did not pull away. He couldn't. Serafina remained perfectly still, except for the rise and fall of her chest. Her crimson eyes locked onto his. She was fragile in appearance, delicate wrists bound in silver, soft lips parted just enough to tempt. But there was no mistaking what she was. She was not prey. She was a predator in waiting, and he had just stepped into her cage. A slow smirk curved her lips. "Your touch," she murmured, voice like silk against stone. "It awakened something in me." Lucian narrowed his gaze, his instincts screaming to be wary. And yet, something primal inside him refused to retreat. His wolf paced beneath his skin, restless, drawn to her in a way that defied reason. His voice was low, commanding. "What are you?" She exhaled softly, tilting her head as the silver chains rattled against the cavern walls. A secret long forgotten, a sin buried beneath stone. Her eyes flickered with something unreadable. "And now, yours to claim." Lucian's jaw tightened. She spoke in riddles, weaving a trap with her words, but he was no fool. He knew the way she watched him, the way she tested the boundaries of his control. A lesser man might have fallen to his knees at the sheer gravity of her presence, but he was not a lesser man. He was a beast, and beasts did not submit. Lucian stepped closer, his body radiating heat, his presence swallowing the small space between them. "You speak as if I'm here to save you," he said, voice like a low growl. "But I don't save monsters." Serafina laughed, soft, haunting, laced with something dangerous. "No, Wolf. You don't save them. You love them." The word sent a slow shiver down his spine. He could feel it now, the invisible thread winding between them, tightening with every breath. It was more than attraction, more than mere hunger. It was fate clawing its way to the surface, a force neither of them had chosen, yet neither could deny. Lucian lifted his hand once more, brushing his fingers along the edge of her shackles. The silver burned him, but he did not flinch. He wanted to feel it. He wanted to know the price of setting her free. She inhaled sharply at the contact, her lashes fluttering. "Careful," she whispered. A single touch could unravel everything. His lips curved, dark amusement flickering in his golden eyes. "Then tell me why I shouldn't." She leaned in ever so slightly, just enough for him to catch the faintest scent of something sweet, like roses wilting in the dead of night. Her voice dropped to a whisper, a secret meant only for him. "Because once I'm free," she murmured, "I will ruin you." Lucian's heart pounded, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. Excitement. His fingers wrapped around the chain, ignoring the sting as the silver seared his skin. With one powerful yank, the metal snapped, the sound echoing through the cavern like a gunshot. Serafina gasped as her arms fell free, the weight of centuries lifting from her shoulders. She stumbled forward, and without thinking, Lucian caught her. For the first time, she was in his arms. Her body was cold against his heat, her breath shallow against his throat. He could feel her trembling, but it was not from weakness. It was from something deeper, something raw. She looked up at him, her crimson eyes filled with hunger. "You shouldn't have done that." Lucian smirked, his grip tightening. Too late. And in that moment, he knew, whatever she was, whatever curse bound them together, there was no escaping her now. Lucian barely breathed as he held her against him, his grip strong, unyielding. Serafina was colder than ice, her body delicate yet laced with hidden power. She did not push him away. She did not run. She only stared up at him with those crimson eyes, deep, knowing, and filled with something dangerous. A smirk played on her lips. "You burn," she whispered, her fingers grazing his wrist where the silver had seared his flesh. "And yet you hold me as if I won't destroy you." Lucian's jaw tightened, but he did not let her go. "I don't fear you." Her gaze flickered with amusement. "Not yet." The words coiled around him, teasing, taunting. He should have been wary. He should have kept his distance. But the beast inside him growled in defiance. He had released her, shattered the chains that had bound her for centuries, and now she was his to control. Or so he thought. In the span of a breath, she moved. A blur of inhuman grace, a whisper of shadow against stone. One moment she was in his arms, the next she was behind him, her presence curling around him like a phantom's caress. Lucian turned sharply, but she was already there, standing before him once more, her dark hair falling in silken waves over her shoulders. Fast, he admitted, his voice edged with something primal. Serafina tilted her head, her crimson gaze devouring every inch of him. "You're not like the others," she murmured. "The ones who came before you. They feared me." They trembled at the thought of releasing what they did not understand. Lucian took a slow step toward her, closing the distance she had created. He could feel it now, something invisible pulling them together, an unseen force that made the space between them feel unbearable. His blood ran hot, fire in his veins, and it was because of her. "I don't fear the dark," he said, voice low, rough. "I was born in it." Serafina exhaled, a sound so soft it sent a shiver through him. "Then tell me, Wolf, what will you do now that I'm free?" Lucian's hand shot forward, fingers wrapping around her wrist. A silent challenge, a claim. She did not flinch. She did not resist. Instead, she stepped closer until there was nothing but breath between them. Her lips parted, and for the first time, Lucian saw it, the faintest glint of fangs behind that perfect mouth. "You're starving," he said. Serafina's lashes fluttered, but she did not deny it. Lucian's grip tightened. His pulse thundered against his skin, loud enough that he knew she could hear it. The predator in her was drawn to it, just as the beast in him was drawn to her. She was temptation itself, a wicked, forbidden thing that should not be touched. And yet, he wanted to touch. Serafina's fingers traced along his forearm, delicate, deliberate. "You should be careful, Wolf," she murmured. "Your blood, it smells unlike any I have ever known." Lucian smirked, though his chest felt tight. "That's because no one like me has ever stood this close to you and lived." Her laughter was soft, but it did not reach her eyes. "You assume you will leave here alive." Lucian's golden gaze burned into hers. "You assume I care." For the first time, something in her expression faltered. A flicker of something raw, ancient, desperate. And then she did something he did not expect. She leaned in, her lips hovering just over his throat. Her breath was cool against his skin, her presence sending a ripple of heat through his body. It was not just hunger that made her hesitate. It was something else, something unspoken. Lucian did not move, did not pull away. His voice was a whisper, a command. "Take what you need." Serafina shuddered. And then, with a slow, deliberate exhale, she gave in. Lucian's pulse thundered beneath Serafina's lips. His skin was fire, burning with the heat of something raw, something untamed. She hovered there, her breath cool against his throat, her fangs aching with hunger. But she hesitated. It was a hesitation she did not understand. Centuries of starvation should have left her merciless, should have made her tear into him without thought. And yet, as she stood trapped between his warmth and the darkness that had once been her prison, something in her wavered. Lucian felt it. His fingers tightened around her waist, pulling her flush against him. He was solid, unyielding, an immovable force that dared her to surrender. "What's stopping you?" His voice was low, a challenge wrapped in a whisper. Serafina closed her eyes. She could hear his heartbeat, the rich, intoxicating rhythm of it. Werewolves were not prey. Their blood was not meant to be touched by creatures like her. And yet, her lips brushed against his skin. Lucian inhaled sharply, his grip hardening. The beast in him stirred, restless, eager, yet he did not push her away. He should have. He should have torn free from her hold and put an end to this madness before it consumed them both. But he didn't. Serafina's fangs barely grazed his flesh when something primal surged through her. A hunger, yes, but not only for blood. It was for him. For the wild heat in his eyes, for the way he stood unafraid before her, offering himself as if he had always belonged to the dark. The thought made her tremble. Lucian felt it. A slow smirk curved his lips. "You're shaking," he murmured. "Is it hunger, or is it something else?" Serafina pulled back, crimson eyes flashing. You think too much of yourself, wolf. Lucian's golden gaze burned into hers. And you think too little of what's happening here. She should have been furious, should have bared her fangs and reminded him what she was. A predator, a creature of the night, forged from shadows and whispers of death. But Lucian did not look at her like prey. He looked at her like a storm ready to meet fire. Serafina willed herself to step back, to sever whatever invisible bond was coiling between them. But the moment she tried, Lucian moved. His hand shot up, fingers threading into her midnight hair, tilting her face toward his. He was not gentle, nor was he cruel. He was simply in control, and she let him be. His breath was warm, the scent of him laced with earth, and something untamed, something primal. You've been alone for too long, he said. Serafina swallowed, refusing to show weakness. You know nothing of my loneliness. Lucian smirked. Don't I? The words struck her deeper than she expected. The mine had been her prison, the darkness her only companion. No touch, no warmth, no voice to call her name. Only cold chains and the slow, aching crawl of time. And now, here he stood, a creature of the wild, his body made of heat and moonlight, his presence relentless. Lucian's grip softened, his thumb grazing her jaw. Tell me to leave, he murmured, voice barely above a growl. Serafina parted her lips, ready to command him, ready to drive him away. But the words never came. A slow, knowing look crossed Lucian's face. He leaned in, not to claim her, not to dominate her, but to see if she would run, if she would retreat into the darkness that had once been her home. She didn't. Instead, she stood there, caught between danger and desire. And for the first time in centuries, she felt alive. Lucian's breath was heavy, thick with something raw and untamed. He stood before Serafina, every muscle in his body coiled with tension, his golden eyes burning with unspoken defiance. The space between them felt alive, charged with something dangerous, something neither of them could name. Serafina did not move. She could feel the heat of his body, the wild energy thrumming beneath his skin. A werewolf, powerful, reckless, and bound by the call of the moon. He was everything she should despise, everything she had been taught to destroy. Yet she couldn't look away. Lucian's fingers brushed against her wrist, tracing the coldness of her skin. He was deliberate, slow, testing, taunting. Still cold, he murmured, tilting his head. Still untouched by the fire. Serafina's crimson eyes darkened. And yet you stand so close, she whispered. You should be afraid. Lucian smirked. I don't fear the dark. I've hunted in it my whole life. The words sent a shiver through her. He was not like the men she had once known, those who cowered before creatures like her, who whispered prayers before the slaughter. No, Lucian was different. He was the predator who did not flinch when the shadows whispered back. His hand moved, gripping her waist with just enough force to remind her that he was not a man accustomed to waiting. Serafina stiffened, but not in fear. It was something else, something unfamiliar, something dangerous. Lucian felt it. His lips curled. Your pulse hasn't quickened, he mused. Do vampires even have fear? Serafina's gaze flickered. Fear, she echoed. No. Lucian's grip tightened, his warmth searing into her frozen skin. Then what is this? His voice was low, edged with a growl. Serafina could hear his heartbeat, steady, powerful, alive. It called to her in ways that defied reason. She could almost taste it, feel it singing beneath his flesh. And yet, it was not hunger that made her fingers tremble against his chest. It was him. Lucian smirked, as if he could hear her thoughts. His other hand rose, tilting her chin up until their eyes met. I could break you free from this, he murmured, his thumb grazing her bottom lip. From the cold, from the hunger, from the darkness you've known. Serafina inhaled sharply. You think a werewolf's fire can thaw me? Lucian's golden eyes glowed. I think you've already started to burn." The word sent something electric through her. She should have recoiled, should have bared her fangs in warning. But she did not. Instead, she remained still, trapped in the heat of his presence, in the weight of his touch. Lucian exhaled, his voice thick with something unreadable. "I inherited this mine, but it wasn't gold waiting in the dark," he said. "It was you." Seraphina's lips parted, but no words came. She had spent centuries locked away, forgotten, unwanted, until now, until him. Lucian leaned closer, his scent all-consuming. Earth, wild rain, the musk of the hunt. His grip did not loosen, did not waver. "Say the word," he whispered, "and I'll tear these chains apart." Seraphina's throat tightened. The thought of freedom should have been intoxicating, should have made her desperate. But freedom was not what made her blood stir. It was him. Lucian's gaze burned into hers, unrelenting. "Tell me, vampire," he murmured, voice like the promise of a storm. "Do you want to be free, or do you want to be mine?" Seraphina inhaled sharply. For the first time in centuries, she did not know the answer. Lucian's question hung in the air like the edge of a blade, sharp and waiting. Seraphina could not answer. Not yet. The chains that bound her wrists clinked softly as she shifted. His grip was firm, unwavering. Heat against cold, fire against ice. She had never felt anything like it. He was too close, his presence overwhelming. His golden eyes filled with something primal, something unyielding. "Say it," Lucian murmured, his voice thick with challenge. "Say you want this." Seraphina's crimson gaze flickered. "You assume too much, wolf." Lucian's lips curled into a smirk. "Do I?" With effortless strength, he reached for the iron shackles. His fingers brushed against her skin, rough against silk, warmth against night. Seraphina gasped, not in fear, but in something far more dangerous. A slow growl rumbled in his chest as he gripped the chains and pulled. The metal groaned, resisting him, but Lucian did not yield. His muscles tensed, his power surging. Then, snap. The first chain shattered. Then the second. The weight fell away from Seraphina's wrists, but before she could move, Lucian caught her. His hands claimed her waist, pressing her against him, unafraid of the coldness that had driven lesser men to their knees. Seraphina tilted her head, crimson eyes gleaming. "You free me, yet you still hold me captive." Lucian exhaled, his breath warm against her skin. "You were never meant to be locked away," he murmured. "Not like this." His hands tightened, not with cruelty, but with something else. Possession. Seraphina could feel his pulse hammering against her, steady and strong. It called to her, a siren's song, tempting her hunger, her instincts, her need. She leaned in, lips brushing just above his collarbone, lingering on the warmth of his skin. He did not flinch, did not pull away. He only watched her, waiting. Seraphina's voice was a whisper against his flesh. "Aren't you afraid?" Lucian's fingers slid into her hair, tilting her face up to his. His golden eyes burned. "I fear nothing," he said. "Least of all you." Seraphina's breath hitched. No man had ever spoken to her this way. No man had ever dared. Lucian smirked as if he knew her thoughts. "I see you, vampire," he murmured. "Not just the hunger, not just the darkness." His thumb traced her jawline, slow and deliberate. "I see the fire beneath the ice." Seraphina's fangs ached, her hunger rising, but it was no longer just for blood. It was for the heat of his touch, the wild energy crackling between them, the way his presence drowned out centuries of silence and solitude. She should have resisted, should have fled before she lost herself in him. But Lucian was not a man who allowed escape. His hands gripped her waist with quiet dominance, pulling her flesh against him, making her feel every inch of his strength, his warmth. His lips hovered just above hers, teasing, waiting. Seraphina's voice was barely a whisper. "You play a dangerous game, wolf." Lucian's smirk deepened, Then bite me, vampire. She shuddered. His challenge was not a request. It was a command. And God's helper, she wanted to obey. Lucian had never feared losing control. Until now. Serafina was in his arms, unshackled, unbound, yet still a prisoner to the space between them. Her body was cool against his, yet she ignited a fire in him that no battlefield, no hunt, no moonlit rage had ever sparked before. Her lips were close, too close. Lucian's breath was heavy, ragged, but his grip did not falter. One hand remained firm at her waist, holding her against him, while the other cradled the back of her neck, his fingers threading through silk-like strands of midnight hair. "Do it," he murmured, voice low, rough. "Bite me." Serafina's eyes burned crimson, her fangs gleaming under the dim lantern light of the ancient mine. She could hear the steady thrum of his heartbeat, so rich, so powerful, so full of life, a temptation unlike any she had ever known. But this was not just hunger. This was something deeper. Her fingers curled against his chest, feeling the heat beneath his skin. The werewolf's pulse was wild, but not with fear, with something else, something dangerous. Serafina had drained kings before. She had taken the life of warriors who had dared to claim her. None of them had ever looked at her like this, like she was not a monster, like she was not death. Lucian's golden eyes gleamed, sharp and knowing. He smirked. "You're hesitating." Serafina bared her fangs in defiance. "You think you understand me, wolf." Lucian's grip on her tightened, just enough to remind her of his strength. "I don't think," he murmured. "I know." Then he moved. In a single motion, he turned, pressing her against the cold stone wall. The force of it sent a tremor through her, awakening something she had long buried. Something raw, something thrilling. She was a predator. She was a queen of the night. Yet under his touch, she trembled. Lucian leaned in, his breath warm against her throat. His lips brushed her skin. Not quite a kiss, not quite a challenge. A tease, a warning. "You want this." His voice was pure dominance, thick with certainty. "But you're afraid." Serafina's claws dragged lightly over his chest. "And you should be." A sharp gasp left her lips as he suddenly tilted her head back, exposing her throat to him. A growl rumbled from his chest, deep and possessive. "Then show me, vampire," Lucian whispered, his voice rough with need. "Prove to me what you are." Her fangs ached. Her hunger roared. With a shuddering breath, Serafina surrendered. Her lips parted, and she sank her fangs into his skin. The taste of him was unlike anything she had ever known. Power surged through her veins, wild and untamed, sending fire and lightning coursing through her body. Lucian groaned, his fingers digging into her waist, but he did not pull away. Instead, he held her closer, as if daring her to take more, as if offering himself willingly. Serafina's vision blurred, her senses drowning in him. She had fed before, but never like this. Never from someone who gave himself freely. Never from someone who met her hunger with his own. Her fangs withdrew, and she gasped. Lucian was watching her, golden eyes burning. A drop of his blood lingered on her lips. He lifted his thumb, slowly, deliberately, and wiped it away. His touch lingered at the corner of her mouth, his gaze never leaving hers. Then he smirked. "You're mine now," he murmured. Serafina shuddered. Because God's helper, she wanted to be. The taste of him lingered on her tongue. Wild, untamed, intoxicating. Serafina stood frozen against the cold stone wall, her breath unsteady. Lucian hadn't moved, his golden eyes still locked onto her, filled with something dark and knowing. He had let her drink from him. No fear, no resistance, only raw, unshaken certainty. He had claimed her without words. And worse, she had let him. The hunger was supposed to fade after a feeding, but Serafina felt something far worse curling in her veins, a craving that had nothing to do with blood. Lucian lifted his hand, brushing his fingers over his own neck where her fangs had sunk deep. The wound was already healing, but the mark of her was there, undeniable. A slow smirk pulled at his lips. "You trembled," he murmured, voice deep and rough with amusement. Seraphina's crimson eyes burned. "You mistake hesitation for restraint, Wolf." Lucian leaned in, his body crowding hers against the stone. The heat from him sent a shudder through her, a cruel contrast to the coldness that had been her existence for centuries. "I mistake nothing," he said, his voice a quiet, dangerous promise. Her claws dug into his forearm. "Then you know this means nothing." Lucian chuckled, a deep, low sound that sent fire licking down her spine. "Liar." Before she could respond, he caught her wrist and lifted it, pressing her own palm against his chest. Beneath her touch, his heartbeat was steady, strong. "Tell me you don't feel this." His voice was softer now, but no less intense. Seraphina hated him for this, hated how easily he unraveled the walls she had spent centuries building. He was not supposed to feel like this. Not warm, not steady, not hers. "I don't," she whispered, but the words were hollow. Lucian smirked, because he could hear the lie in her pulse, in her breath. His grip tightened just enough to remind her that she was no longer untouchable, no longer beyond reach. And then, as if testing the fragile thread between them, he dipped his head, his lips grazing the curve of her throat where her pulse no longer beat. A whisper of a touch, the threat, a vow. Seraphina's breath hitched, her fingers curling involuntarily against him. He wasn't supposed to be this close. He wasn't supposed to make her feel anything. But the way he touched her was different. Not as prey, not as an enemy, as something far worse. "You don't understand what you've done," she murmured, barely able to summon the warning. Lucian lifted his head, golden eyes piercing through her. "Oh, I do." He released her then, stepping back, but his absence did nothing to break the invisible hold between them. The air between them crackled, charged with something neither of them had the power to sever. Seraphina swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to stand tall, to conjure the icy composure that had kept her alive for centuries. "I should kill you for this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucian's smirk deepened. "Then why don't you?" Her fingers twitched, because she couldn't, because something had shifted, something irreversible. Because he had tasted her darkness and had not run, because she had felt his fire and had not burned. Lucian stepped back, his eyes never leaving hers. "You belong to me now." Seraphina clenched her jaw. "I belong to no one." But the moment the words left her lips, she knew they were a lie. Because in the space between them, in the hunger that had nothing to do with blood, in the way her body still burned from his touch, she was already his.